Jose Gonzalez, President of PIMEC, Confederation of Micro, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises of Catalonia, and Vice President of SME United, European Association of Craft, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, based in Brussels. It is a pleasure to know you and to have this opportunity to speak by video conference. Ironically, COVID-19 prevention has given us this opportunity, this good opportunity to speak with you. Also, this opportunity comes, of course, from the management of our common friend, Jordi Ayala. Thanks, Jordi. Up to now, I will follow in Spanish language your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Varoufakis.
Thank you very much.
¿Es okay? Thank you. Hoy nos hemos levantado con la satisfacción de este encuentro con el señor Varoufakis, pero también con una triste noticia, como parece ser el cierre de la planta de Nissan en Barcelona. Esto puede suponer la pérdida aproximada de 20.000 puestos de trabajo, especialmente del sector del metal. Desde PIMEC vamos a pedir a todos los agentes sociales y a todo el mundo pues la máxima colaboración para conllevar ese gran problema, y también pedimos que se reactive el Plan Nacional del Automóvil con los recursos necesarios para intentar compensar en lo posible esta importante pérdida. Volviendo a la videoconferencia con el señor Varoufakis, creo que sobraría, por su notoriedad, su presentación. Nacido en Grecia, estudió matemáticas y economía en Essex y Birmingham, catedrático y economista de prestigio, miembro del Parlamento griego, que en el año 2015 dimitió como ministro de Finanzas del gobierno griego en los difíciles años que Grecia sufrió la crisis del euro. Dimitió por sus diferencias muy críticas con la Troika Europea sobre cómo debía tratarse la crisis, especialmente la de su país, y dimitió también, según sus propias palabras, para facilitar la negociación de Grecia con la Unión Europea. En el año 2016 fue cofundador del partido Diem 25 y en el 2018 nació de este partido el Mera 25, que lidera el señor Varoufakis en el Parlamento griego. Es profesor de Teoría Económica y Política de la Universidad de Atenas, que enseñó y enseña en diferentes universidades, Cambridge, Sydney, Glasgow, Texas. Su actividad política es intensa. Es autor de numerosos libros bestsellers, libros de economía y política, entre ellos, para citar uno de los muchos, A Brief History of Capitalism, bloguero activo y autor de numerosos artículos y conferencias. Es también analista económico en emisoras de prestigio como la BBC, CNN, Sky News, Bloomberg TV y otras que podríamos enumerar. Como resumen, se podrá o no estar de acuerdo con sus ideas, pero no hay duda de que estamos delante de un líder altamente cualificado, activo en la defensa con pasión de sus idearios políticos y económicos y reconocido a nivel mundial. Es una gran oportunidad el que hoy podamos conversar con él. Ahora le pasaré la palabra al señor Varoufakis. Mr. Varoufakis, please, if you want to address us your presentation, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph Gonzalez. Thank you to Jordi Ayala, who connected us. Thank you to all of you who are part of this webinar or teleconference. It is true that even though COVID-19 has separated us, in other ways it has brought us closer together, both as citizens of the world and particularly of the European Union. It is particularly satisfying to be addressing representatives of the small business community in Catalonia, in Spain. Hopefully others are watching outside Spain. Allow me to begin by focusing on the importance of small business, but not in a way that is usual. When you have a monetary union, like we do with the Eurozone, where you've got countries with different composition of capital intensity and size of businesses. So you have a country like Germany, which has large firms. Even the medium-sized firms are very large by the standards of Greece or Italy or even Spain. And then you've got other countries with many more smaller firms with lower capital intensity. This means one thing, if you look at it from a macroeconomic perspective. It means that countries like Germany are always going to have greater concentration of capital and market power that translates into greater price-cost margins than in a country like Spain. That also means that the greater concentration will give rise to a trade pattern within the Union whereby the greater capital concentration of larger businesses gives rise to net exports coming from the countries with a greater capital concentration to the countries with a lower capital concentration, from the countries with the larger firms to the countries with the smaller firms. Now, if you add to that, because of the fact that we live on the Mediterranean, that you've got in our countries, in the countries of the South, you have a greater reliance on tourism, which by definition has lower capital utilization and capital intensity than car production or production of locomotives. This means that a monetary union like ours in the European Union was always going to contain macroeconomic imbalances. Now, before the euro, the way in which this imbalance led to equilibrium was through the steady depreciation of the currency of the countries of the South with the lower capital intensity. But once you lock the exchange rates with the euro in particular, you end up with a situation where the only way in which you can maintain equilibrium is if there is a constant flow of loans from the banks of the countries with the net exports and the capital intensity, Germany, for instance, Holland, to the countries with the more small firms, with a greater preponderance of small firms, so that those loans can become the source of aggregate demand for the net exports of the surplus countries. Which means that the total amount of debt in a monetary union is unevenly distributed towards the countries of the South, towards the countries with a larger number of small firms. Now, that debt can be private or can be public. In Spain, you have a much larger percentage of private debt relative to Italy. In Ireland, there is even more private debt relative to public debt. But the total amount of debt reflects the capital intensity and the relative size, the average size of companies in our countries. Now, if you don't have a mechanism for recycling deficits and surpluses, like, for instance, the United States have, through the Social Security system, which is common, through the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Scheme, that ensures that if a bank in Arizona goes bankrupt, it is not the state of Arizona that must bail it out, but it is the Federal Reserve that does it. These are surplus recycling mechanisms. We don't have them in the Eurozone. They were designed out of the system, of membership. What happens is you have a gradual build-up of these imbalances, and then when something happens, in Wall Street usually, some kind of collapse, like Lehman Brothers in 2008 or COVID-19 now, then you have a sequence of bankruptcies, private bankruptcies, state bankruptcies, in the countries with a larger number of small businesses. And then what happens is, take for instance the situation we find ourselves in now. What happens is, you've got the European Union's structural funds, the European Investment Bank, now the Recovery Fund, which we will see what transpires with that when it happens. But these funds are there not as recycling mechanisms between poorer and richer, surplus and deficit regions, but there are funding machines that usually they are designed to fund larger businesses in Spain, in Italy, and so on. But because you've got the preponderance of smaller businesses that are not capable of connecting themselves to the funding mechanisms, even after the crash, the small business sector, which is the lifeline of countries like Spain, Greece, Italy, and so on, are the ones that cannot benefit from the funding, the purpose of which is to refloat the European economy. So, in order to maintain and turn the European Union, especially the monetary union, the Eurozone, into a sustainable macroeconomy, which it is not. It is not designed as a sustainable macroeconomy for the reasons that I alluded to. What we need to do is we need to deal simultaneously with three things. Management of public debt at the European level, management of private debt at the European level, and management of investment at the European level. At the moment, we have none of those three. All three are absent. And we can see the result in the acceleration of the imbalances at every level. Every time there is a crisis, whether it is Wall Street collapsing in 2008, whether it is the debt crisis that begins to spread as a result of the collapse of Wall Street, of Deutsche Bank, of Société Générale, of BNP Paribas, then the infection moved because it was a pandemic, an economic pandemic that moved from Lehman Brothers to Deutsche Bank, from Deutsche Bank and Société Générale and Santander to the Greek state that went bankrupt in 2010. That led to the bailouts of Portugal, of Cyprus, of Ireland. Those came attached with austerity strings that attacked mainly the small business sector of the whole of Europe, but in particular of the South. Then you had the bailout of the Spanish banks, which again was purchased at the expense of more austerity for Spain. So this thing constantly, we keep running after a crisis which is migrating from one sector and from one country to another, but we are never able to catch it because we don't have the systemic approach that we ought to have. As DiEM25, our movement, 2 years ago, we proposed our Green New Deal, and just very briefly, let me explain what the systemic interventions that we proposed consisted of. Looking at public debt, what we try to propose is something that was legal within the existing treaties, because if you try to come up with ideas, there are many ideas that could be implemented, but would require a change of the treaties. And you know what that means. It means it will never happen. We'll all be dead before the treaties get changed, before 28, however many there are, parliaments and referenda approve the changes in the treaties. It will simply not happen. So we try to come up with proposals that would work within the existing rules, the existing treaties, and the existing charter of the European Central Bank. So very briefly, 3 were the main policies that we proposed last year in the European Parliament elections, but we were proposing this since 2017. The first thing is, regarding public debt, we proposed that the public debt of every country is split between 2 parts. The Maastricht compliant part, 60% of national income, you're familiar with that, and the rest. And we said that the Maastricht compliant part should be serviced by the European Central Bank using European Central Bank bonds that the Central Bank issues on behalf of Spain, of Greece, of Italy, even of Germany, for that part of the debt, which was legal according to Maastricht. And the state repays those bonds. So the ECB is simply a go-between the markets and the state for the part of the debt that we were allowed to have according to Maastricht. And what is the benefit of that? The benefit of that is 60% of total GDP in the form of public debt across the Eurozone would suddenly have a 0% interest rate, because this is what the ECB bonds would fetch in the global markets. So just by doing that, with no haircuts, and within the rules of the treaties, what we would have is a reduction of public debt across the Eurozone of 40% of its net present value. That was our calculation. That would have been totally therapeutic. No monetary financing, just the ECB extending a conversion loan facility for the part of the debt that we were allowed to have. And the rest, the remaining part of the debt, which exceeds the Maastricht limits, well, that's down to Spain, to Italy, to Greece, to service. But that would also be strengthening Maastricht, because effectively it would create an interest rate differential between the legal debt, according to the Maastricht compliant debt, and the rest. When it comes to investment, green investment in the technologies of the future, which Europe is not investing in, like batteries, like electrification, like artificial intelligence, investment that can help small business just as much as it helps large business. What we needed in Europe, and this is what we proposed, was a new agency, a new investment, European Investment Agency, let's call it, that would direct in exactly the same way. Do you remember the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, the OEEC, which effectively distributed the monies of the Marshall Plan in the 1950s? The OEEC then became the OECD later. But initially, its job was to distribute to businesses, small businesses, medium businesses, and large businesses, the Marshall aid from the United States. So we need something like that. We don't have an investment agency. The structural funds coming from Brussels are very bureaucratic, and they are structured in such a way as to benefit primarily large businesses, Siemens, not small businesses. So we need an investment agency for Europe that has connections with the networks like your network of small business, and in the context of a pan-European green investment plan, a Green New Deal as we call it, diverts investment funding there. Where does the money come from? Well, not from the European Commission. The European Commission's budget is tiny, 1% of GDP more or less. So, and most of it goes to the common agricultural policy in any case. Even if you double that, it's not enough. We needed, before coronavirus, we needed 5% of GDP to go into this green pan-European investment plan. And that must be real money, not like the Juncker plan, which was make-believe money. It was fictional money. It never existed, really. It was only existed in the fantasy of Jean-Claude Juncker. Our proposal is very simple. The European Investment Bank should be given the green light by the European Union Council to issue bonds, net issuance of bonds of 500 billion every year, and that the European Central Bank just makes an announcement that it will support those bonds in the bond market, in the secondary bond market, if the interest rate starts going up. That would ensure that the ECB would not have to do it, and that the interest rates would be very low. And you see, 500 billion a year would be the amount of excess liquidity which exists in the financial sector of the European Union. Excess liquidity which is now crashing the banking sector by pushing interest rates below zero and creating all the problems to the pension funds, to the insurance companies in Germany, all those problems that are giving rise to the ultra-right, the Alternative for Deutschland, that are responding with such great anger to the negative interest rates, reducing the nest egg, the savings of average families in Germany and in Holland. And thirdly, we proposed a particular form of banking union where we create a new jurisdiction, a Eurozone jurisdiction, and banks that are failing should simply move from the national jurisdiction to the EU jurisdiction and effectively being taken over by the European Central Bank in the way that the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, does in the United States when an Arizonan bank, for instance, goes under. So this is what we were proposing last year, before coronavirus. Now that we have this emergency, we believe that the same idea can be turbocharged. It can go faster. And it should go faster, because we are facing a tsunami of bankruptcies across the European Union. For the first time in the history of capitalism, supply and demand have been hit at the same time. Even in the Second World War, even in Germany in 1944, while it was being bombarded by the Allies, investment and GDP was rising. The coronavirus crisis is unique because both supply and demand are pushed down simultaneously, and our states do not have the fiscal capacity to refloat all boats. Small boats, your small business sector, as well as larger boats, in Spain, in Greece, in Germany at once. So we proposed that the ECB bonds that we were already proposing before should go ahead to a tune of 1 trillion immediately. Those bonds should be 30-year bonds, and that buys the European Union 30 years, 3 decades, to decide how we're going to create a fiscal union and a political union in 30 years. And, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say that if we cannot do it in 30 years, then we will never do it. 30 years is a long enough period during which to do it. And if we can't do it, then there will be no euro, because the euro will not survive without a fiscal and political union for very long. We also suggested that the European Investment Bank, together with the European Investment Fund, the EIF, the European Investment Fund, which is much better tuned towards funding small businesses than the European Investment Bank, are given the green light to issue the bonds that are necessary for the small business sector. And we calculated that at 600 billion every year for the next 4 years. And finally, the European Central Bank should do what the Central Bank of Hong Kong did, what the Reserve Bank of Australia did, what even Donald Trump did, which is to credit every bank account of every business or household in the European Union with 2,000 euros emergency solidarity funding. Whether you're rich, poor, Dutch, German, Spanish, or Greek, you should get that 2,000, and then maybe another 2,000. That would be 750 billion in one go. That would be very quick, because the moment you start doing quantitative easing, and effectively what you're doing is the central bank lends Deutsche Bank or Santander. You put a bank like that in between the central bank money and small business, most of it is lost. It will never get to the small business, never.